predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill.
Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades.
There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of watching a piece of trail camera footage, when the room stops making noise. Not because someone called for quiet. Not because anything dramatic happened in the first second. The silence just arrives on its own, like it was always going to. Because the people watching it understand, even before the clip ends, that what they are seeing changes something. The footage recorded inside a South Florida preserve last year was one of those moments. And the story it opened up is unlike anything researchers expected to find when they first started trying to understand what the Everglades was becoming. To understand what that footage revealed, you have to understand what the Everglades actually is, and what it used to be. Most people picture it as a swamp in the way they picture all swamps, still, dark, vaguely threatening, full of mud and mosquitoes. That picture misses almost everything. The Everglades is a slow-moving river. It begins near Orlando, and it flows, barely, at about a quarter mile per hour, southward, through a vast, shallow sheet of water that spreads across nearly 2 million acres of South Florida before draining into Florida Bay. It is not a lake. It is not a pond. It is a river that moves so slowly, it looks like it is not moving at all. Inside that barely moving sheet of water, life built itself into one of the most intricate food webs in North America over tens of thousands of years. Wading birds gathered by the thousands in colonies so large they could be seen from miles away. Alligators served as ecosystem engineers, digging holes in the limestone that held water during droughts and gave smaller animals a place to survive. Deer, raccoons, marsh rabbits, opossums, and bobcats moved through the sawgrass. The Florida panther hunted at the edges. The gopher tortoise burrowed in the sandy upland zones, every piece connected to every other piece, and the whole system ran quietly, continuously, for longer than human memory can hold. Then, it started to come apart. And it did not come apart slowly. The Burmese python entered the picture somewhere in the mid-1990s. The exact origin is disputed, and probably not singular. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 destroyed a reptile breeding facility near Miami, releasing animals directly into the wild. The exotic pet trade contributed steadily throughout the decade. People who bought baby pythons, small enough to hold in one hand, manageable enough to seem like a reasonable pet, eventually found themselves living with a 13-foot, 100-pound predator that had no business being in a South Florida apartment. Some were released intentionally. Some escaped. The result, across nearly 2 decades, was a reproducing wild population embedded in one of the most biologically productive wetland systems in the world. The Burmese python is not just a large snake. It is a large snake that happens to be nearly perfectly adapted to a subtropical wetland environment it did not evolve in, hunting prey that did not evolve to recognize it. The python hunts by ambush and by heat detection. Its scales match dead sawgrass and dark mud with an accuracy that makes the animal functionally invisible until it moves. It can remain motionless for days. It can slow its metabolism to almost nothing during lean periods and survive on a fraction of the food a warm-blooded predator would need. It produces large clutches of eggs, sometimes close to 100, and loses almost no offspring to predation, because there is nothing in South Florida equipped to kill a healthy adult python. And the prey it targets, raccoons, opossums, marsh rabbits, birds, has not evolved any behavioral response to an ambush predator it has never encountered. The data that emerged over the following years was not subtle. In the hardest-hit survey corridors, raccoon populations had dropped by more than 99%. Opossum numbers were similarly catastrophic. Marsh rabbits and foxes had effectively disappeared from large zones where they had once been common. Bobcat populations crashed. Biologists who had spent entire careers working in the Everglades described driving survey routes at night and seeing nothing. No eyes reflecting headlights, no small animals crossing roads, no movement in the brush. The prey base that had supported the whole system for thousands of years had been largely consumed. Efforts to reverse the damage began almost immediately, and continued for years with genuine commitment and enormous resources. Public hunting programs recruited thousands of participants each year. Professional removal teams worked full-time, covering territory in airboats and on foot, using dogs trained to detect python scent, deploying thermal imaging drones during cooler months when the snake's body heat was more detectable against the cooling ground. Biological lures, acoustic deterrents, and chemical tracking methods were all tested. The results were real. By the mid-2020s, removal teams had pulled tens of thousands of pythons from the Everglades system. The effort was not symbolic. It was serious, sustained, and technically sophisticated. It was also nowhere near sufficient. The population estimates for Burmese pythons in South Florida have ranged from tens of thousands to several hundred thousand, depending on the methodology used. And every serious researcher acknowledges that the uncertainty in those numbers is enormous because the snakes are so difficult to detect. Even the most optimistic removal scenarios suggest that the current pace of extraction is not keeping up with the pace of reproduction. The pythons were not losing. They were, by every metric that mattered, still winning. And then the footage arrived. The camera had been placed in a preserve as part of an ongoing wildlife monitoring study. It was not placed specifically to catch python encounters. It was there to document general wildlife activity, to get a sense of what animals were using, the area, and when. What it recorded was not what anyone was looking for. A bobcat, one of the native predators that had been nearly eliminated from large parts of its former range, had located, stalked, and killed a Burmese python. Not a small one. The python outweighed the bobcat by a significant margin. But the bobcat had found the moment when the snake was vulnerable, committed to the attack with the full force of its body weight and jaw pressure at exactly the angle required, and won. The footage went quiet in the room where it was first reviewed, not because it was graphic, but because of what it implied. A bobcat killing a python is not, by itself, a conservation victory. One predator killing one snake does not change a population dynamic. But what it suggested, what made the room go still, was that the relationship between native wildlife and the invasive snake population might not be entirely static. The native animals were not just victims waiting to be consumed. At least some of them, under some circumstances, were learning to fight back. Subsequent reviews of trail camera data from across the region began turning up other examples. Alligators, which had largely coexisted with pythons without directly competing for the same prey in the same way, were documented taking younger snakes during water crossings. Florida panthers, which had mostly been observed avoiding pythons, were showing up in footage from areas with documented python activity in new ways. The pattern was not dramatic. It was not a reversal. But it was a shift. The ecological significance of what was happening was still being worked out when a second discovery complicated everything further. Researchers at the University of Florida had been tracking the spread of an internal parasite, a lungworm native to Southeast Asia, that had arrived with the Burmese python population and was now moving through Florida's native snake community. The parasite had been documented in nearly 24 native species. It had spread far beyond the original range of the python population. It was traveling through the food web on its own, transmitted through intermediate hosts in the soil and water, no longer dependent on pythons to carry it from place to place. The biological impact on native snakes was severe. Animals infected with the parasite showed respiratory distress, weight loss, and behavioral changes that made them easier to kill and harder to replace. In some survey areas, the decline in native snake populations correlated strongly with the spread of the parasite, rather than with direct python predation. The invasion was not happening at one level. It was happening at two simultaneously. A large predator consuming the mammals, and a microscopic organism weakening the reptiles that held the middle of the food web in place. But inside the parasite data, there was something that did not fit the pattern. The Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper, common throughout the same habitat being hit hardest by the lungworm, kept coming back clean. Survey after survey, region after region. Researchers checking cottonmouth specimens for evidence of parasitic infection found almost nothing. The species appeared to be largely resistant to the same organism that was devastating its neighbors. Something in its biology, possibly immune response, possibly venom chemistry, possibly some aspect of gut physiology that researchers had not yet characterized, was protecting it. The mechanism was unknown, but the fact of it was clear, and it pointed toward a line of research that could, if pursued, offer tools for protecting other species. At the same time, a separate restoration effort was generating cautious optimism of a different kind. The eastern indigo snake, the longest native snake in North America, a powerful and aggressive predator of other snakes, once ranging widely through the longleaf pine forests and scrublands of the southeast, had been functionally absent from much of its historical range for decades. The causes were habitat destruction, the collapse of gopher tortoise populations it depended on for shelter, and direct human persecution. Conservation programs had been working for years to restore the habitat, rebuild the tortoise populations, and reintroduce captive-bred indigos into protected areas. The result, after decades of patient effort, was something that felt almost miraculous when it finally appeared on a trail cam. Wild, hatched eastern indigo snakes. Not animals that had been placed in the landscape, but animals that had been born from parents that had been placed in the landscape, reproducing on their own in wild conditions, were moving through the underbrush of a North Florida preserve. For the first time in half a century, the species was self-sustaining in part of its former range. The eastern indigo is a snake that eats other snakes. It is fast, aggressive, and immune to the venom of North American pit vipers. Its strategy for subduing prey is not constriction. It is jaw pressure, speed, and persistence. What it has never encountered in any documented encounter is a Burmese python of full adult size. The indigo's natural range and the python's expanding northern boundary are on a collision course. When that collision happens, nobody knows what the outcome will be. The size differential is enormous, but the indigo's advantages, aggression, speed, and evolved predatory strategy for handling other snakes are not trivial. What the footage from the Florida swamps revealed was not a victory and not a defeat. It was something harder to name and more important than either. It was evidence that the ecosystem, battered, chemically altered, invaded at multiple biological levels simultaneously, was not simply absorbing damage passively, it was responding. Native predators were developing behavioral responses to the invasion that had not existed before. A resistant species was pointing toward a potential biological key. A once-lost apex predator was re-establishing itself in part of its former range. None of that means the Everglades is recovering. The python population is still enormous. The lungworm is still spreading. The mammal populations in the hardest-hit areas have not come back. The road from where the system is now to anything resembling ecological health is long and genuinely uncertain. But the assumption that had settled over this story, that the ending was known, that the trajectory was fixed, that the Everglades would simply continue losing until there was nothing left to lose, that assumption no longer holds. The swamp is not passive. The evidence is on camera, and the next chapter of this story is going to be written in the water, and the sawgrass, and the quiet places between the trails, by animals making choices in the dark that no human program designed, and no human policy required. The bobcat, the cottonmouth, the indigo, the alligator, the prey animals learning to read a landscape, they are slowly reclaiming, one encounter at a time. The aftermath nobody expected is not a resolution. It is a fight, and for the first time in a long time, the outcome is genuinely open.